Hi all, Rusty Rob here. Welcome to another video. I'm really excited about this one. It's a conversation with JT, who was the senior program manager at Microsoft during the instrumental time when they developed TypeScript. JT has also contributed to Rust while working at Mozilla. So I'm excited to talk about TypeScript and the early years of when it was developed, how they innovated, how they grew the ecosystem and all that. So welcome, JT. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So what is TypeScript and why was it built? What's the first step of using
uh,
it?
yeah, it's kind of fun. We could go back to the early days before TypeScript was first an idea. Uh, Back then, since it was created in Microsoft, we cared a lot in Microsoft about how do we develop for the web, and different things over the years were attempted. And at that time, there was efforts to try to compile C# down to JavaScript. And things like Office were using that and having some amount of success with it. But there was definitely a sense of, why don't we give them something that's closer to JavaScript, closer to what what we could kind of build from JavaScript. And also at that same time, there was efforts, it's called the Chakra engine, which is the JavaScript runtime that was part of the web browser, the Microsoft Edge and IE11, I think, worked on Chakra. But that engine, the person that designed that engine, was kind of keen on this idea of, if we had type information in our JavaScript, maybe we could run that JavaScript faster. We could, infer the right types more quickly, and then use that knowledge to run it faster. So these kind of were confluence, and yeah, back 2011, Luke Hoban and Steve Luco. So Luke Hoban was one of the JavaScript PMs, and Steve Luco was the creator of the Chakra JavaScript runtime. And so they kind of got together, and they put this hack together for a demo presentation around, what if you added types to JavaScript in this kind of lightweight way, and what could you do with it? And that was popular enough. It had just enough steam that they had started building a team around it. And yeah, by a year later, that had really kind of grown into the beginnings of TypeScript.
And that's around the time you joined Microsoft, is that right?
Yeah, so I joined in 2012. Back then, it was still called Strata. That's like the code name that the internal project had. It had maybe 2 or 3 teams just kicking the tires, like just trying it out, and writing a bit of code, but not like being fully built on what would become TypeScript just yet, because it was still changing a lot. So they were kind of giving feedback. Then the TypeScript team was rolling that feedback into the design. So I kind of joined a release or two before it became TypeScript, helped them fix some of the type system design things that needed to be fixed, and helped them release TypeScript, and then stayed on as the program manager after that point.
I see. So you kind of transitioned into program manager because I was wondering how technical is a program management role, and also
Yeah,
if wouldn't mind just taking a quick step back because there could be a few
sure.
grads watching. They might wonder, how did you get into such an interesting line of work? So you studied computer science, and because I, I kind of graduated into full stack development and websites and things like that, but working on languages and compilers, it seems a bit scary. Like,
Yeah,
every
yeah.
time I learn a new language, I get better and get more confidence. But yeah, what's your technical background, just a little bit, if you got, if you don't
Sure.
mind? Yeah.
Uh, so my technical background, so I got my computer science degree back in 2000, and then worked in industry in various things, telephony and signal processing and whatnot. And I did that for 6 or so years, and at one point had an issue in one of the contracts I was working in, where my code had to be rewritten. And I felt this like deep programmer shame that that was the case, that something I wrote had to be rewritten. And then I went back and really started studying software engineering and the tools, like the different programming languages. How did I go wrong? How could I have done it better? And then that led me on this path of maybe I can make better programming languages. Maybe that's maybe not the thing most people would do when they would, practice their skill. But for me, learning about how programming languages work really helped demystify some of the dark arts of how to do programming. And so, yeah, around 2006, I started working in programming language design. By 2010, I was going to graduate or postgraduate for folks not in the American system. So doing that and getting a master's in compilers and programming language design. And I was going to go to get a doctorate, but Microsoft said, well, you want to stay working on TypeScript or do you want to get your doctorate? Like, take your pick. And I was like, shall I stay working with some of the top folks in the field? Yeah, I think I probably will. So I stayed at Microsoft rather than getting my doctorate.
Sounds like a cool place to be. And yeah, I can really relate to that journey of trying to make your programs more reliable, because I guess I started off with Python. I was quite passionate on that and helped organize the New Zealand Python conference a little bit. And it's just, I really liked how readable and simple it was to get something going quickly. But then once my program got bigger, I realized I need a compiler or some tools to really, and some type safety to help me refactor the code and make something more robust. So kind of, and I've done a bit of Java and C# and can kind of see that in TypeScript a bit. And Go and Rust more recently. So you stayed at Microsoft, and I guess so. Steve Ballmer, but I think Satya became CEO around 2014 or something, and I heard that he was quite liked open source, and he helped out with Azure and developer tools and things. I'm just trying to think, how big was Microsoft at the time? And it sounds like a small team, so he's probably not aware of TypeScript, but what is the motivation for them to work on projects like this? You mentioned they were trying to use C# and things like that to build web applications. And
so back in 2012, we should look up when Steve Ballmer became CEO, because I feel like I went to see him talk one time when I was still an intern. So that was early, like summer of 2012 in the States.
That wasn't a developer.
Yeah, I mean, he's very high energy. So, I mean, he kind of has that reputation, but I found him to be someone who, like, it was just a whole bunch of interns and various folks. And he said, ask me any question, I will answer anything. And people were throwing him it wasn't soft pitch. They were throwing him some hard pitches. And he just loved that. And I was like, that's pretty cool. I like when like the leaders are saying like, here is like, I'm here for the next however long we are. I'm here and I will answer questions. I really like that. So open source back in 2012 at Microsoft was an extremely rare thing. So in the developer division, I think there's only one, maybe two teams that were doing any ongoing open source projects. A lot of the projects were kind of throw it over the wall and then it's done, right? There was a couple like ASP.NET related things that I think are open source at the time, but nothing else beyond that. And so I came in, I had an open source background and, had contributed different projects in like the last, 12 years or something. Not a heavy amount of experience, but more than, say, if you just kind of go straight from school into corporate, you're not going to have any. And so I kind of came in, and that was, I think, one of the things I helped the team with actually early on, the TypeScript team, because I had to fight through lawyers and tons of intellectual property discussions and lots of stuff that's probably way too boring to talk about on the podcast, but has to be boxes ticked before this team can do open source. And, it was only a couple of years later that Microsoft was like, nope, open source by default, and make it much, much easier. But at the time, I was like, very difficult. So the idea...
that was a game changer, having it open.
Yeah. Yeah. And they pitched it. So this is before Satya became CEO. They pitched it to Satya as like, we're going to make a new language. It's going to be open source from day one. And he got it. He kind of understood the whole TypeScript story. He understood going open source. He understood going after the kind of the web developer, and like blessed it. So we were okay. It was just like getting through all the legal stuff to actually pull it off, but we managed. And yeah, then it went open source. And at first it was on this thing called Codeplex. So we weren't allowed to get on GitHub at first. And then it's just like one hurdle after another. Then finally we were allowed to get on GitHub. That project, so I was program manager, and we'll talk about what a program manager is, I'm sure, at some point. But between 2012 and 2015, I kind of guided the project. And by 2015, it was just starting to take off. Angular 2 was rewritten in TypeScript, and some of the other libraries were really starting to take an interest. So that was really when it was starting to kick up. And in the background, one of the things that was happening at Microsoft was there was that shift towards being more friendly to open source. Other teams wanted to do open source. .NET was starting to look into it, other folks. And so because TypeScript had that, head start of a year or two, we became the people that, people said, okay, come give us a talk, to our team. Tell us how to do open source. How did you pull it off? Because you're growing. How did you do that? And so I talked to many teams about how to do open source just based on the TypeScript experience. So yeah, it kind of all happened all at once around those years.
And what's the motivation for going for the web developer? Is it because you're falling behind in mobile and you want web to win because you're worried about Android and iOS, or is it because of like things like VSCode emerging? I'm not sure if it wasn't around then, but having it kind of tied in similar to C# and that whole .NET experience.
There was early on some tie-in with Visual Studio, but when Visual Studio Code came out, like that kind of moved on. I think a lot of the thinking at the time was JavaScript is incredibly popular, but it is not something that, think in Microsoft scales. If you have teams of teams, you don't want to throw them at JavaScript because there is no way of enforcing good modularity, good interfaces between these different components. Writing JavaScript at large scale was like an incredibly difficult task. And so having TypeScript really for internal use, but also obviously for external as well, is to say, like, how do you write JavaScript that scales? And that's kind of been the TypeScript story from the very beginning, was around, okay, so here's this language that's like JavaScript, but I actually can enforce some of the type checking and modularity, and then, kind of grow from there.
Yeah, is it risky building a technology for internal use if it doesn't get adopted outside of your company? I'm thinking
Yeah.
at Meta we had Hack and Flow. We had to use Flow because of the size of the mono repo at the time, and you see Google had like Dart, which is kind of being used in Flutter, but it didn't really take off beyond that. So I guess it can work out great, but they always innovate more outside the company, right? So like you need the world to kind of use it as well. Is that
Yeah.
fair? Or
I would say that's fair. And also there's kind of a multiplier that happens. So we released TypeScript in 2012 publicly. And one of the first things that happened in the community is someone started putting together this thing called Definitely Typed, which was a repo of all of these TypeScript definition files. So for existing JavaScript libraries, you just plop this into your project, and now you have type information for that existing library. And that became quite a multiplier in terms of, oh, well, I'll just drop this in, then I have a TypeScript experience for code that I already have. Well, that's nice. So I think that there was things like that that wouldn't maybe necessarily have happened if it just stayed, insular, stayed inside of Microsoft. But you have these like fun, happy accidents almost if you go public, and then they have their own growth in their own lifetime that really injects some energy into that project.
yeah, And what there's Coffeescript at the time, which I never used. And
There is. Yeah, there was.
what's the key
Yeah.
reason like TypeScript beat Coffeescript?
I mean, CoffeeScript was a different syntax on existing JavaScript, but it wasn't typed. And when we kind of showed off TypeScript, the way I would generally show it off, and this is even back when it was just released, I would open up an IDE, start typing, and get completions and get error messages because I passed the wrong type in to standard, JavaScript library functions and stuff. And this idea that I could catch it right then while I'm coding, I think is a much different experience than, having a slightly different syntax to things. So it kind of grew from what was, I kind of, when I was talking earlier, the idea was, oh, the types will make things faster. That grew to types will help you at like developer time. And that really became the strength, I think, that really propelled it.
I've seen some people saying, will TypeScript replace JavaScript? And some people say it's not possible because TypeScript has to transpile into JavaScript, so it can't exist without JavaScript. But you could make the same argument for like any high-level language in bytecode or assembly, or binary. Yeah. So, but do you see the adoption of TypeScript kind of overtaking JavaScript, or will it be kind of a spectrum depending on the project or something?
I mean, it's hard to say. If you look at, let's see, when I left in 2015, the surveys were saying that about 5% of professional JavaScript was written in TypeScript. Now the surveys are saying something like 50-50, I think, somewhere. I mean, somewhere like 40-60, 50-50. I mean, it's much higher. And so I think if it continues, and who's to say it will, it's hard to predict these things. But if it does, then the majority of professional JavaScript will be written in TypeScript. And even though there's a compile step, like that almost doesn't matter to professional JavaScript stuff because you're already probably doing bundling, you're doing like linting, and you have other compilation steps, quote unquote. So having a TypeScript compilation step isn't really that onerous by comparison.
Especially with all these NPM and package managers that just can initialize your project from a seed with compiling already running as you edit the code and things. It's the barrier to entry is lowered, especially with. That's one thing I liked about Angular 2 is it would just be set up when you create a new project with the CLI.
Yeah.
What kind of questions should I ask next?
I was just thinking that. Yeah. I was just thinking Dino can run TypeScript directly too. I feel like that's an interesting future that we might fall ourselves into. More things supporting TypeScript natively. I mentioned the program manager thing. Let me just explain that real quick, and if that gives us ideas, but I'm also willing to bounce around a bit. So at Microsoft, a program manager, this is from the old style of program management, is that developers work on the software, but who handles like everything else, right? It's not just writing code, it's interfacing with customers, it's like interfacing with your community if you're open source, building out your requirements. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that is the kind of second 90% of the project. And that's the program manager's job at Microsoft. And I was part of developer division. So a program manager is a highly technical person that also, they can speak, code, they can speak to developers, but they think more like top down in a way. They're more strategic. And so the idea is to kind of keep the project on track so that it's solving the right problems, going towards the right solutions, and kind of fixing things that the customers need along the way. Like users might have certain patterns of things they need fixed, and then you kind of present that, and the developers kind of fix those. So it's really hard to describe like the breadth and depth of what that role is, because it basically collects everything that isn't the code and says, okay, I'm taking that on as my responsibility, and then kind of helping grow it from there.
Who's the users? Is it internally at Microsoft or at first? Is it partnering with other JavaScript projects?
Anything. yeah, anything and everything. So at first I was doing going and giving talks to internal teams before it was public. After it was public, I was going to conferences and giving talks there, standing for hours and hours on a conference floor, so people could come and ask questions and stuff. And all of that, plus running the design team and making sure that we were solving the right problems and whatnot. So being that full interface all the way in, which
I
was kind of
think,
cool. I mean, I went to grad school for a few years, and it kind of burnt me out a little bit on programming language design. But I had this team of people that were just experts at it, so I just felt like, oh, okay, I'll just feed them the right stuff, and then we're good.
yeah, and I'm keen to see how you innovate within a large company because I think that's a challenge. But first, um, yeah, one thing I was thinking was, as you're talking about that, it's really key that JavaScript is you can write JavaScript inside TypeScript. So if someone's
Mm-hmm.
hesitant to use TypeScript instead of JavaScript, you can be like, well, you're just typing JavaScript. And I feel like that's why TypeScript was more appealing to me initially than like Dart and
Right.
Coffeescript and things like this. But when you were talking to these people, convincing them to use TypeScript, how did you convince them? Like, how did the vision of TypeScript change over time? And how did you get feedback?
Yeah, I feel like the original, once the vision locked on, JavaScript that scales and that idea, I feel like it's just been refining that year after year after year. When we were first kind of showing it off, one of the things we early locked in on early was that I can just take one JavaScript file, convert it to TypeScript, and then compile that to JavaScript and use everything else the same. And that really gentle incremental approach, once a team started doing that, and then they saw the benefit of that TypeScript in the file, then like, okay, now I want to convert 2, now I want to convert 10. And that incremental approach, I think, was, especially early on, one of the things that helped sell it, because even internal teams didn't want to like necessarily buy in. So one of the teams I'm thinking of is the team that became the Visual Studio Code team. So they were one of the very early adopters of TypeScript. And at first, they only had like one, maybe two developers that had written any TypeScript, and they had only done a couple of files. But they kept evangelizing it because they're like, yeah, but I get early errors. I get auto completion, and I don't have to think about it. And now I'm going to write a little bit more and a little bit more. And then they would show their coworkers, and it would just kind of grew organically. It wasn't something where, um, we weren't like pushing it onto people. We wanted people to pull the technology and like want it from us. And then when they did, they could give us good feedback to say, I really want to keep going. Here's what I've done so far, but I hit this issue. And then we go back to the drawing board, see what that issue is, kind of zoom in on it, have the folks kind of dissect it and say, okay, maybe this part of the type system could be a little bit better. And then just kind of rinse and repeat that.
Yeah, the
That I,
incrementally adoptable seems key.
yeah,
Like it seems more difficult to get to your end goal because your incremental thing, right? People say you need to, when you're doing moonshots or something, you need to revolutionize things, not just incrementally improve them. But
mm.
for develop ecosystems and things, it's key, yeah, to be incremental adoption. But then, how did you have like a larger vision in mind that you were trying to get to, like incrementally? Yeah.
I mean, I kind of had the idea personally that TypeScript should be one of the biggest languages. I didn't know how big, but I thought if this could be how JavaScript is written in the future, why not? JavaScript's one of the biggest. TypeScript should be, a significant percentage of that. And I'll go ahead and like write out a little bit. So my manager at the time, who I won't name, but they know who they are, was saying, TypeScript will never be the size of C#. It will never pass it. And I thought, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's true. And, you know, at least for me, my intention was let's remove all these barriers. You're talking about JavaScript and this incremental approach. And the TypeScript in 2012, 2013 was a bit rigid. If you just copied and pasted JavaScript in, it wouldn't necessarily figure out all the types and you'd have to help it out. And over the years, they got more and more fancy with how much like flow sensitive type checking it would do and how much it could infer. And it got much better at working with just like vanilla JavaScript copy paste. And I think that, it was things like that too that removed the boundaries and made it feel like, oh, I can just adopt it. No big deal. So yeah, I think some of the early ambition was to grow quickly. And I think a lot of it was just implementing this every year. We polish more and polish more and polish more until there's really no reason not to use it.
And why was it called TypeScript? Is it because it's adding types, or is it because it's like type-level programming?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just that simple. I mean, we tried a bunch of names at the time, and a lot of them got shot down. I don't even remember what some of them were, but yeah, eventually TypeScript was written on the board, and I remember Hejlsberg, who's the architect for TypeScript. I remember him just kind of walking up to some of the other leadership and said, "This is the name, make it happen. Let's go. Like, let's move on." So yeah, it just kind of, and it kind of has the right flavor, right? JavaScript plus types equals TypeScript. So there you are.
That's how I saw it when I first started using it. I'm like, okay, I'm just using some interfaces and it will tell me if I've got the wrong type. If this isn't assignable to this, then
Right.
okay. But now that I've actually started learning TypeScript a bit more in depth, I see type narrowing and type level programming, and that seems quite innovative to me. Are these new ideas to TypeScript, or were they borrowed?
I'm sure some of it comes from the research. So I worked up on the TypeScript project up until about 2015. We were just starting to add the flow sensitivity at that point. And the stuff they've added in the 8 years since, I mean, I look at it, I'm like, wow, that's pretty clever. And yeah, I've written a bit of TypeScript here and there since then, but I haven't really dove in and kind of gone deep with it. So yeah.
Towards the end, I was hoping to ask, like, what would you take from Rust and add into TypeScript? But anyway, if you had a magic wand. But right now, just talking about the innovation side of things, I often think large companies, corporate companies, struggle to innovate, and so often they acquire startups to innovate faster. But with a project such as this, I feel like it's maybe better that it's in a bigger company. And like, how do you innovate? Because you want, like, when you hire people, you want to maybe hire more agreeable people. You probably wouldn't hire someone like Steve Jobs or something like that, potentially. But if there's a group, is there like a group that's kind of thinking, what features should we add, and are they kind of, is there much conflict there?
Yeah, so when we started, I think the total size of the team was somewhere between 8 and 10 people. And it stayed that size through almost the whole of my tenure there. I think by the end it was maybe 15, 18. So it had that small startup vibe. And we didn't have a lot of resources. We didn't have a lot of marketing. It was basically like shoestring. So you come in, yeah, okay, we've got Anders Hejlsberg, we've got Mads Torgersen on the design team. He's the architect of C# these days. But he's also contributed a lot to TypeScript, especially in the early days. So we've got these like really well-known engineers, language designers, but beyond that, we kind of had to just scrape and pull together for like anything that we want to do. They'll let us go talk at conferences if we get a talk accepted, but we had to scratch and claw our way for each little bit of growth. And I think that made us very lean. It was a bit stressful, not gonna lie, but I think it made us very lean as a team to keep keep a lot of focus, make sure that we're always making progress all the time and kind of proving ourselves. It's not that we were going to lose our jobs if we didn't. It wasn't that kind of pressure, but it was a sense of you're going to be pitted against other projects come, review time and demonstrating what you've done. And so you definitely want to look, like you're doing well compared. Not that it was a big competition, but it's just the natural aspect of you've got only a few people on the particular team and you want to grow a certain amount. And it's like, well, it'd be great if we had more resources. Well, how in the world are we going to get those? You have to really kind of push and kind of prove yourself to do that.
And does that lean focus help you focus on what matters so you don't kind of collapse under your own weight of
I think
trying
it's
too many
something like
things?
that. Yeah. Yeah. There's a saying that once you get t-shirts made, you die. so that kind of tells you that's not, I mean, obviously internal teams got made t-shirts all the time, but there was a sense of you wanted to stay leaner than making t-shirts for as long as possible. So you were well under the radar in terms of, the big management looking at, teams using a lot of money and time and whatnot. But yeah, so we didn't get t-shirts made probably the whole time I was there. We got stickers made once or twice. Like it was very tight. But again, that kind of really focused us. So we wanted to, like, I spent a ton of time talking to JavaScript library authors and users of various things and trying to understand, like, what is the big piece that if we solve that, then we'll unlock the door for some of these folks and really make that happen. And we were talking about Angular earlier. That was one of those things where the Angular team announced this thing called @script. And I was like, what is that? @script is a superset of TypeScript. So then I called them up and I was like, would you mind if we flew down and just chatted with you for a couple of days to see if we can make everything just be TypeScript? And to their credit, they were totally game for that. So
Gotta put your pride on the shelf a little bit.
What's that?
Everyone wants to build it themselves, but that was really cool that you could convince them and that they were open to that, because at the time that seemed like a pretty massive decision. I remember switching to Angular 2 and thinking, wow, okay, TypeScript, what's this? So that's the reason I was using TypeScript. I also saw Angular Dart there for a little bit as well.
Yep.
Not sure, are they going to do it in Dart or in TypeScript? But I think in hindsight, that was a really great decision. And a lot of people kind of maybe teased the Angular community a bit for using TypeScript at first, but now it looks like a lot of the React community is starting to adopt TypeScript and things as well. So Angular was a bit ahead of time with some things such as RxJS and TypeScript.
Yeah. So the this was really, we had a kind of connection a little bit with the React team before the Angular stuff, and they asked us to add JSX support. So I don't remember when that was, 2013, 2014, something like that. And we kind of dragged our feet a bit because JSX, that seems kind of very special to React. And then Flow was announced. It's like, oh, okay. Had we jumped on it, maybe they would have just directly gone with TypeScript. But because we didn't, they had every reason to spin up an internal team to pull off something like that. And so when the Angular thing came up, I was like, we're getting on the call. We're putting engineers in front of whiteboards. We're going to talk this thing out, because there is no reason for us to split into, half a dozen typed versions of JavaScript. They're just, like, Microsoft isn't trying to own types of JavaScript. It's just trying to have like one thing that we can all basically use. It sounds funny that you would think, oh, we should make a bunch of money. But for that particular project, the idea was just to give developers one consistent thing that they could use internally and externally.
I find it's really hard from the outside. Like some of these companies like Google, they say they're very transparent internally. This is like around 10 years ago. They talk about the transparency. But from the outside, as someone using like Google Cloud Platform or something, it's hard to really tell what's going on, especially when they've got a mono repo where they can change stuff, but it could break it for external people and things. So, but the fact that TypeScript was on like GitHub and things like that, oh, well, not GitHub at the time, but that was open source. I think maybe that helped convince people as well. They wouldn't have, Angular wouldn't have used it if it wasn't open source and things.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, just being transparent about like our roadmap, where we were trying to go, the things we were trying to implement, when we'd have design meetings. I don't know how often I did this. I tried to be good about putting some design notes up so people could see those and just kind of get a sense for what we were thinking about. So it wasn't a surprise. That was one of the things I learned very early on. It's like, it's just not good to surprise your user base. Please don't ever do that. Recent news from maybe some giant gaming company, perhaps, is a good example of that. But,
I think I know. Anyway, you mentioned one person on the team who came from C#. I'm not sure if I can pronounce the name. Is it Andres Hejlsberg?
Anders Hejlsberg, yeah, he was the
he was
C#
quite
creator.
important with C#, right? So
yeah,
did that help with TypeScript as well? Because people were like, oh well, if that person that caliber is working on TypeScript, it's going to be successful. Like we should try. Like, did that help with marketing and growing?
Yeah, I mean, Anders is in my field in programming language design, Anders is highly respected because, I mean, he created Turbo Pascal, created C#. He's the architect of TypeScript. I mean, he's just good. He's really good at what he does. And his design sense is kind of amazing. It's very user focused. He's always thinking about not just how to solve the problem, but imagining that he's the programmer writing it and how it feels, and always connecting the two. And that's something that I always really appreciated. Like I see programming language design likely inspired by him, that it's always this pairing of user-centered design plus solving hard design problems at the same time.
It just sounds so difficult because there's so many constraints. Like you could think, I don't know, did you guys think it should be functional versus OO? I mean, the DOM is OO, but then JavaScript can sometimes be more performant if it's functional, and then you've got this event loop and closures and things. So, and then you got to have backwards compatibility with, you got the standards and things like that. So, were you guys stressed out? Was everyone stressed out with the requirements and things?
I would kind of characterize it as just kind of leaning into the challenge, not to make it sound a bit corporate, but that's kind of was the attitude of the team, that it can be done. We just have to put our brains together and we can do it. Before Strata became TypeScript, it had its own class syntax. And I think I gave a talk one time and I kind of showed off what some of this class syntax looks like. But ECMAScript, the standards body that TC39 is the standards body creating ECMAScript, that's the standard that JavaScript comes from. So they were working on classes for ECMAScript, and we knew once they locked in that all the browser vendors were going to take on that implementation of classes. So pretty early on, we're talking 2011, 2012. In fact, the class syntax change was in 2012, so right before we released. The idea was, no, we are a strict superset. Like, we are not adding a bunch of new syntax. In fact, there's very little that's in TypeScript as of a few years ago when I was using it. That wasn't just bog standard JavaScript with types and layering types on top. So I think once they stopped trying to create a whole new language or creating an extension on JavaScript even, and focused on, no, we're just going to type JavaScript, and that is really our main focus, then I think once they made that choice, then the focus was they could just pour their energy into doing that better and better. And I think that's really what allowed them to polish that year after year. That's what I was talking about.
Yeah, I think most of the types disappear. Classes and enums are maybe slightly different. So there's some hacks you can do with type
Yeah.
level programming and runtime validation with things like Zod and stuff. But yeah, yeah, I had a question. What was it? So you're high level, but are you getting into the weeds much as well with the technical implementation?
As the TypeScript PM, some. So I did a bit of design, but mostly it was the kind of everything else style. So yeah, I wasn't doing as much of the design pieces, mostly just trying to make sure they're solving the right problems and whatnot.
And these days, a lot of people look at GitHub stars or Stack Overflow surveys, state of JavaScript surveys, or some of them can be a bit biased. Um, what do you think helped you get the most traction, and how did you measure that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it early on was like we were talking about, going and actually talking to people, making sure that the next round of fixes that we were making actually moved the project in a way that actually solved the problems that people were hitting in the real world. The patterns that they're writing their JavaScript, can we type them? Well, okay, if we look at it a particular way, okay, maybe we can add a little bit to the type system, and then we would unlock another style in JavaScript. JavaScript was a bit of a wild west because it wasn't really typed before that. So a lot of different patterns organically arose in how people wrote their JavaScript. And so we just had to spend a lot of time looking at code and seeing, okay, how can we describe that to a type system? What do we have to do? What do they have to do? And how much can we infer and whatnot? So there's
And
definitely a lot of that. Yeah. And then working with the library authors. So even before Angular and before React, we were talking with Ember and some of the other libraries to be like, okay, what would it take for Ember to ship a TypeScript typing in their release? Okay, how much, and Yehuda Katz, who was kind of known for Ruby on Rails 3, he worked on Bundler, he worked on Cargo. If you're a Rust person listening to this, he also, of course, worked on Ember.js, and so he liked TypeScript and wanted to use it, but Ember used some pretty novel JavaScript patterns. So it was definitely a bit of, them designing and us designing, going back and forth and back and forth. And I think it was things like that. So a combination of solving real problems that users were hitting and also solving things that the JavaScript library authors were hitting, so that come maybe their next release, they can announce TypeScript support. The more users see that, they're like, oh, okay, so I guess TypeScript is blessed now from this library that I care about. And then I think that's really what started the ball rolling.
how does TypeScript work? Is there an AST tree and a checker phase and things like that? And like the developer tools, some build systems are not always compiling the code. Like I think Vite, that it's just taking some shortcuts. So so how does TypeScript work? And was it first written in JavaScript?
Yeah, I don't remember what the very early Strata stuff was written in. I don't think it was JavaScript. I think it was written in something else, and then after that, they moved on to writing it in JavaScript. And so, yeah, you could kind of think of, again, my understanding of the architecture is very much the 2012 to 2015 years. But back then, the architecture, the kind of compiler architecture really cared about two things. One, the type checking, so all the machinery for doing type checking. And we mean type checking not necessarily in the kind of way that you think of it from universities, where it's like, okay, then we type check all the things, and then, okay, uh, that's it. I mean, that's one part of what it did. But remember, this thing is really intended for use in IDE. So I need to be able to hit dot and get completions in very quick amount of time. So it had machinery that not only would it type check your system or type check the program and give you the error messages, but it also had an ability to kind of lazily pull on the tree and solve the types for just that little piece of the tree, and then give you the completions at that point. And that kind of stuff was kind of a layer of sophistication that the C# team created for their IDE support. And so Anders and other folks coming from that C# side were like, well, we have to bring this with us because this is great and it will work good in the sense that all this is written in JavaScript, but it still needs to work really fast. So we'll just use some of these tricks that we learned. So there's the
Cool.
kind of the IDE. Go ahead.
That sounds cool. I was just saying I quite like algorithms, so I could imagine a depth first search, but with that case, maybe they'd have to go upwards. But when you're
Yeah, it
refactoring the
tracks the
code, it must
dependencies.
be
Yeah.
difficult to keep track of.
Yeah. So as it's typed, it does the full parse and then tracks the dependencies for solving that one location. And then, and then there's the transpilation step. So this is like taking the code they wrote, not only stripping out the types, but, if they, back then, a lot of browsers were only like ES3 level, let's say. And so they didn't support all the classes. Maybe they're ES5, but they didn't support all the class syntax that was being added. So then Typescript would compile the class syntax down to the JavaScript functions, and just kind of encode it as keep the same functionality but written in the older JavaScript style. So it had that component too. So it could always compile down to the older versions of JavaScript, and it had the type checking.
Yeah, it sounds pretty creative. If someone wanted to read through some of that code and understand it, for example, TypeScript or Rust, where would someone start? Would they go to the GitHub and just start looking in the source folder?
I mean, yeah, that's what I'd be tempted to do, is go to the TypeScript repo. And for me personally, I would go as far back as you could. If you could get somewhere around 2015, 2014, and see what that compiler looked like there's a lot of machinery that has to go in as more and more features get added. And so modern TypeScript probably has a lot of those extra things, but the early versions were, in a sense, almost a kind of, I hate to call it like a pure implementation of an idea, but it's much simpler system, and then it got more sophisticated. So I'd probably start at the earlier one. There was a rewrite of the TypeScript compiler done by Anders Hejlsberg before 1.0. Yeah, before 1.0. So they had written it in a kind of an OO style, and he was looking at JavaScript performance and said, we can't keep writing it like this, because there's a much faster way to write this compiler. And he went off on vacation to Hawaii or something and came back 2 weeks later and had rewritten the compiler in a more functional based style. And it was like 5 times faster for all the examples he was showing. I was like, okay, this is ridiculous. I don't think we should rewrite it. They're like, no, you get upvoted. We're rewriting it. So I'm like, okay, fine. And for the first couple of years, it was like close to like that rewrite that he wrote. And the original rewrite that he showed was just, I mean, it was the cleanest looking thing. Like, you could tell. Definitely has skills. And very, very readable.
Are you starting to build up a set of unit tests and things at this point?
Yeah, we had a whole suite of real projects. So it wasn't just, I mean, we had unit tests, but we also had this what the heck is that called? Not an acceptance test, but a suite of real projects that had to build and type check correctly. And that's how, when we were tuning the type system, we would tune it and check to make sure we didn't break anything. This we had like 50 or 100 like TypeScript projects that we were compiling against of like real world code.
Well, and thinking of the developer experience, you mentioned you type a dot and get autocomplete quickly. For that, it seems difficult because there's multiple different IDEs. Was there a thing such as language services at that time that were in common to IDEs?
Yeah, so LSP wasn't around just yet. So that's the language server protocol. TypeScript had its own thing. I want to call it TS server, but I might be misremembering the name by a little bit. But it was intended as something that you could run and then ask questions. And that likely was one of the inspirations for the language server protocol, because VS Code supported TypeScript before LSP came along, and it used some of the capabilities in this server architecture for being able to run and query against a code base. So yeah, I think that there was a lot of the functionality for being able to say, okay, give me all the completions here, refactor, rename this thing, or find all the references. All that functionality is kind of laid out in the pre LSP days, and then become part of the language server protocol once that gets released.
Okay. Yeah, I think one thing I liked about Angular was it's more like you're typing HTML instead of JSX. I underestimated how quickly they would get IDE support for JSX and things like that. Just on a quick tangent, what do you think of VS Code versus Intellij? Have you tried them both?
For TypeScript development, you're saying?
Yeah, in general, it seems like VS Code is taking off, and the plugins can be written in TypeScript, whereas IntelliJ, it's more like Kotlin, but they have specific IDEs for Rust and WebStorm and things like this. So I'm using IntelliJ, but some other people on the team are using VS Code, so we just use both.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, mostly because I worked with the VS Code team. Like there was even times we were throwing ideas back and forth with each other. So I feel a little bit of a kind of a personal connection to it. I've been using VS Code since then for basically everything. I dabbled in Emacs and Vim and whatnot, but and some of the IntelliJ stuff. But it's just VS Code just mostly does exactly what I want. So once you can go fast, it's hard to change.
Yeah, we're using the Monaco editor in one of our projects.
Mm-hmm.
So we can run VS Code in our application in the browser, which is pretty cool.
Oh, nice. Yeah, it was the Monaco team. They were trying to build an online editor before it became VS Code, and eventually also an online editor.
Yeah. So what do you think were the biggest technical challenges TypeScript had to overcome?
I mean, I think the story of how its type system evolved is probably a very prolonged epic about how to handle more and more sophisticated JavaScript under the hood. I mean, we were having to come up with, like, even early days, we were thinking about, okay, we're going to overload this function, but not give you two separate definitions. We'll give you one definition with a bunch of signatures. And then just based on those signatures, pick which one. Which to most TypeScript developers is just like, okay, yeah, but that's the easy stuff. We have much more complicated stuff these days. But even the thing that I mentioned was actually pretty novel. There wasn't a lot of programming languages that did that. We added flow sensitivity. Flow, the system from Meta, also had flow sensitivity, but most programming languages don't have flow sensitivity in their type system. So these like little bits and pieces had to be added in order to really build up something that was sophisticated enough to work with modern JavaScript. And yeah, I would say that was probably it, because it's not something that you could solve all at once. It's kind of like, to work on New Shell, I was talking to the New Shell folks the other day, and I said, when we hit 1.0, we'll look back and say, we could not have designed this 3 or 4 years ago, because it took those 3 or 4 years to really gain the experience to be able to, actually design and implement 1.0. I feel like TypeScript was the same adventure. So back in 2012, we didn't know deeply how JavaScript was being used and the patterns that were being used well enough to design the type system to be what it is today. Like, it's just, it took those many years of experience and trying things out to get to where they are. So yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of a bit like domain-driven development. You need to get to know the domain, and you want to keep the same people on the project for a long period of time, if possible.
Yep.
Well, what if there's any features from Rust you could bring to the world of JavaScript or TypeScript, what would it be?
I don't know. I mean, my go-to answer would be something like, just copy the pattern matching. Give me deep pattern matching. They might have something like that in TypeScript these days. I honestly don't know, but that's the first thing that comes to mind, is to be able to just, the patching in Rust feels like that to me is the thing I always come back to and start from.
Yeah. I feel like also there's times they follow the JavaScript syntax, obviously, like unshift. I often forget, do I need to unshift or splice, and things like that. Whereas Rust, it feels a bit more similar to Python, the standard library and things like that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see kind of, we're talking about TypeScript and Rust, but there's kind of that middle ground of more and more things supporting WebAssembly, which means Rust has a way into web technology in a way that's never had before. So I'm always just kind of excited to see where that goes as that continues to grow.
Yeah, and with WebAssembly, what does it compile down to? You have a memory allocator and a sandbox of memory. Is that right?
What does it compile down to? I
Like,
mean, the code.
Yeah, what's the outputs that you can use it in the browser?
Yeah, WebAssembly in a sense is kind of just a virtual machine that's really close to what a lot of other machines would do, and so you're compiling the just regular source of the program down to that, and then there's kind of these, like you're saying, for like memory allocation, there's a kind of stand-in similar functionality that you're compiling as well, that the WebAssembly system would then be using. So it's doing the allocation in the WebAssembly side.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. We use Docker, and Docker seems quite heavy, whereas WebAssembly seems like it could be a more lightweight way to get reliable code into TypeScript or JavaScript projects in the browser, or maybe in Node.js. Yeah, it's really interesting to see where that goes. I know Docker's working on WebAssembly containers and things as well, but you have to be really careful with the dependencies to keep the sizes small sometimes.
Right.
But I think that's the power of WebAssembly and Rust and things. So is there any, looking back on TypeScript, is there anything you would have done differently?
I probably would have responded a little different to that meta email about JSX in hindsight. I mean, I don't think I would be I think there's always a temptation to be like, oh, you should have done this, you should have done that, but you don't know it at the time. Like in the moment, you're just trying to learn, as fast as you can and apply what you've learned that next week and kind of rinse and repeat. I mean, when TypeScript was first announced, we were all sitting around our laptops watching the social media response, and it was 50% negative. Like they were like, what is Microsoft doing in JavaScript? They don't know anything about web development, et cetera, et cetera. And just kind of sticking with it. I feel like, you can make mistakes. That's okay. And I don't really have any big regrets about how we went about it. But I definitely made mistakes along the way and tried to correct them, but hopefully didn't make big ones. But yeah, the JSX thing, coming up with TSX a little quicker probably would have helped a bit. But yeah, I feel like by the time then the Angular stuff started happening, having learned the lessons and being like, okay, here we go. We're just going to lean into solving this. Let's just solve it. And yeah, I think no big regrets.
It's tough. You always get negative feedback when you release something. I feel like the sentiment towards Microsoft changed a lot though, and especially with Satya coming on board, it feels like Microsoft turned around with TypeScript and Azure and things like that.
Yeah.
Did you feel that within Microsoft? I guess it was maybe a bit early when you were there.
Yeah, it's well, it's an interesting kind of chemistry at Microsoft. It's an interesting way people thought. I mean, Microsoft had been kind of attacking open source, attacking Linux for years, and a lot of open source people were like saw Microsoft as the devil, basically. And Microsoft also watched some of its competitors just like, take off, like Google and Chrome and the success of Google Chrome and not being able to make IE successful despite pouring a ton of energy into it. I think that there was definitely a lot of humbling that also went on in Microsoft. And I caught a lot of that coming into, 2012 and whatnot. People like, we have to do better. We have to learn how to do better. We have got to go out and we've got to, learn the lessons and lick the wounds and keep going. And so I think leaning into open source was one of those mea culpas, like, yep, we should have done this. Now we're going to do it. And yeah, it did make a big difference, I think. And I think Satya understood that even before becoming the CEO. And then after becoming CEO, that just kind of carried that on. It's like, yeah, we've got to win hearts and minds clearly somehow. So Azure's got to do it. Developer division's got to do it, etc.
Yeah. Do you also then you moved on to Mozilla, and the CEO of Mozilla at some point created JavaScript and then went on to make the Brave browser. Do you know what they think of TypeScript by chance?
Oh, what Brendan thought of TypeScript?
Yeah.
Brendan. So I was on the JavaScript committee, the TC39 committee between 2012 and 2015, and talked to Brendan a few times. I think he was friendly towards the idea. He kind of knew that it was solving a problem, but there was definitely just in the committee a hesitancy of standardizing it and saying, okay, you've correctly cracked the nut of how to properly type JavaScript. Right? I think there was more of a please go prove yourself and then we'll talk. Probably we'll talk in 10 years, maybe. There was kind of that, proving that you can really do it. But I mean, he wasn't definitely not against the idea. And they ended up pretty early on. So the Flow team and I represent the TypeScript team, we went and presented to TC39 about types and how we want to head in that direction. And they said, please don't add types like type checking to JavaScript, but we will immediately allow you to reserve the syntax. So : space type. in those cases, and maybe some of the keywords that we're using, just like just to reserve it, because I knew this is not a question that's going to go away. We're going to have to revisit this question at some point in the future. We have to, we'll just go ahead and reserve that now. But yeah, Brendan was pretty okay with it. I mean, he also, so he led some of the technical stuff at Mozilla, and he also was a huge champion for Rust in the early years too, to kind of keep it alive.
That's my next question.
Yeah, he definitely was.
Cool. Yeah, it seems like there's great innovation with TypeScript and Rust. Definitely two of my favorite languages. Would you mind just chatting a little bit about that chat with the Angular team you mentioned earlier? So you flew across to talk about AppScript. Was it like a 1 or 2 day chat, or like what did you talk about?
Yeah, so that was basically it. So we flew in. We were going to stay there 2 days and spend most of the time just around whiteboards and eating together, and kind of doing a combination of solving engineering problems, but also just giving some bonding time to these two teams that didn't really know each other. And because I wanted them to see us as open source problem solving engineers, no, like we're not trying to take anybody's lunch or anything like that. We're not trying to extinguish anybody. We're just trying to do a good job. And that clicked pretty early on. So we flew in, we chatted with Igor and Mishko and some other folks around again, literally around whiteboards. We're just like writing, okay, what are the things AppScript needs, and then going one by one through each one to see like, okay, all right, so we need this kind of decorator thing. What in the world is that? How can we deconstruct that into parts? What does that do on the type system side, and what does that do in the code generation side? And it was a lot of that. Like that part was a bit of a blur because it was just a lot of time, a lot of taking notes, a lot of making sure that we had captured enough that when we flew back, we would just start implementing it. But yeah, by the end of the it was just like the way I gave a talk at the Angular Conf. I think it was in 2015, early 2015, from Salt Lake City.
Okay.
And I think you can find that talk on YouTube. Cool. But yeah, I characterize it as just like sticking a bunch of talented engineers in a circle solving problems and just hashing it out until they'd solved them all. And so yeah, we did that for a couple of days. Then we flew back to Seattle and just started hacking on actually implementing what we came up with. And it was only a couple of weeks later, we got in a call with them again, and they were kind of saying, well, we may still want to do this AppScript thing because maybe that gives us more control over what it does. And then I was like, are you sure that you want to take on maintaining a programming language and handling all the tooling and whatnot? And I said, let me show you something. Then I got one of the engineers to hook their laptop into the video sharing screen, and they just built Angular 2 from the compiler version that was on their laptop. I was like, there you go. Angular 2 is built in only TypeScript. Wow. And I think that sealed it at that point. They're like, okay, we'll work together. You're good. Let's go.
And the rest is history. I think I've just got 1 or 2 more questions, and then we can wrap up. Someone wanted me to ask, what would happen if you ditched all of web standards and you created a new browser in Rust or something like that, starting off with just text, but then also being able to show rich like media and things like that? What would happen? Bit of a curveball question.
How in the world would you do such a thing?
It seems like the web's just entrenched,
Yeah, I was playing around, and you can find this on YouTube. I've got a Systems with JT is a YouTube channel I used to run, though I've since left YouTube. But I looked at Oberon, which was a system from the creator of Pascal. So he kind of stuck with his idea of what a good programming language was. Pascal, and then Modula, and then ultimately Oberon, which was an operating system and a language mixed together. And it has the strangest version of hypertext I think I've ever seen. And I would love to see someone take a modern take on Oberon and see what it would be like. But the idea is that in Oberon, text can become function, like a function call. So if this text is somehow a special name of something, then the things that follow it are its arguments. So you can kind of be reading along, and all of a sudden, here's a function. I can click on it, and it will run whatever the backing definition of that function is, which might be defined in this big document. But it's all like literate programming in a way, but like the most extreme version of literate programming. Yeah, I think it's not saying that I would want all of the World Wide Web to run on Oberon-esque hyperlinking, but I thought it was cool, and I thought, wow, something like that in a larger scale would be an interesting way to introduce people to programming and introduce like a way of doing much more sophisticated linking between concepts and ideas and documents and stuff.
Yeah. I think people start these projects not knowing how hard they're going to be. So,
I love the ambition, though.
yeah. So the last question, or maybe it's two questions in one, but how should someone decide if they should use TypeScript or JavaScript? Because there seems to be a bit of debate about that at the moment. And so maybe there's a sweet spot. And then what's the future look like over the next 5 or 10 years, especially with LLMs and ChatGPT 4 and things coming in and WebAssembly?
Yeah. I mean, I'm clearly biased. I would use the type language if I was going to write any application of any decent size. Yeah, JavaScript by itself gives you flexibility to do things that the type system kind of gets in your way. But I mean, I spent the last, 17 years working to make programming easier through type systems. So, um, yeah, even New Shell, the project I'm working on now, that's all typed, right? So you have IDE support for writing shell scripts, which is kind of novel. So I mean, yeah, I'm heavily biased to the typed version. I'm okay with the compiler telling me no if I can work a little bit harder and have something that's more readable to more people, more maintainable, et cetera, et cetera. That's good. That to me is a good trade-off. Where's programming going? Gosh, AI, I don't know. Boy, that is a big question mark. I can't tell if it's a bubble or if it's real, to be honest. I mean, AI of the past has gone through many cycles, but it always ended. And then some years later, another AI cycle would start. I think that, LLMs and stuff now are pulling out, they're basically remixing code samples and giving you code samples for the things you ask for. And that's helpful. That's kind of like a Stack Overflowy thing to do. But can it solve problems? Is it going to be able to solve problems? Well, if the answer is no, then there's no risk, to the day job developers, because someone's going to have to be there solving problems and actually putting the application together and designing it and testing it and stuff. If they get to the point where they're able to solve real logic problems, then yeah, that might be an interesting turn in the industry, but I don't think it's there yet.
Yeah, maybe it'll put me out of the job, but at the same time, maybe it would help the economy enough to support me.
Yeah, maybe.
But yeah, it's definitely interesting times, and yeah, the types definitely help reason about bigger systems and things, and the compilers really helped me more and more as I've grown as a developer. So yeah, thank you so much for your your contribution to developer productivity and type languages. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on the channel today. And
oh yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, it was really interesting hearing all you had to say. So thanks a lot.
Of course. Thanks for having me.